So one of my favorite types of food, which is a weird way to start, but one of my favorite types of food is barbecue. And really, of the barbecues, pulled pork is probably my favorite. And you know how when you experience something for the first time, sort of that first thing you experience is what you hold on to and you sort of elevate above everything else. So I had pulled pork and I really fell in love with it. And it's still hard to beat. And the funny thing is, I don't really remember loving barbecue until high school. I know I had had barbecue before that, but there was an experience, and it was probably due to the specific restaurant that I went to in high school that really just made me fall in love with barbecue, where it was just done in such a way that was so much better than anything else I had experienced in the past. And so I fell in love with it. And the thing about barbecue that I appreciate is the more I learn about it and the more barbecue I experience, you just see that there's all these different types of varieties, all these different types of options, all these different types of meats. Chicken for me is sort of the low-level, entry-level barbecue, but then you've got pulled pork, like I said, there's sausages, there's briskets, and somehow I had never really experienced burnt ends before I came to Thomasville, so that was a fun new thing that I've experienced in the last couple of years. But for the longest time, it was just pulled pork was my go-to. That's the only thing I ever tried. In fact, it was probably the fact that I moved to Texas to attend seminary, which is where, when you're in Texas, you have to eat brisket. So that was really my big introduction into brisket. And when brisket is done right, it is also extremely tasty. The other weird thing that I experienced about barbecue in seminary when I was in Texas is we have people from all over the country that lived there and came to seminary. And I don't know if you know this, but some people consider anything that you cook on a grill as barbecue. So even hamburgers and hot dogs. So the first time I was invited to this particular family's house for barbecue, I was a little disappointed with what they served me. But depending on where you are in the country, there's all kinds of differences about barbecue. There's actually, I'm going to give you some incredible history about barbecue. There are four main styles of barbecue in the U.S. There's Carolina style, there's Memphis style, there's Kansas City style, and then there's Texas style. Now, there are other states or cities or regions that claim to have a style, but those are the four main ones, and don't be fooled by anyone else that tells you any differently. Those are the four main ones. There's also all these different sauces where you've got tomato base, or you've got vinegar base, or you've got mustard base. You can have sweet sauce, spicy sauce. You can have sweet and spicy sauce, which I really like. And then on top of that, there's all these different dry rubs that you have to consider for the seasoning as well. So there are just so many different delicious options out there when it comes to barbecue. And one of the things that also I've learned is that there are some people who are very opinionated about their barbecue and what is the best type of barbecue and what is not the best type of barbecue. And there are some people that would even say that the other types of barbecue don't even really count as barbecue. So the thing is, as much as I like barbecue, I haven't really tried to cook it personally a lot. One, I don't have a smoker. I don't even have like the traditional charcoal grill at this point, so I don't get into that. And in fact, there is one recipe that I do have, and I hesitate to even call it barbecue because you cook it in a crock pot, which just seems like it shouldn't qualify as barbecue. But I learned this recipe when I was a student pastor, and there was a family that had 4 kids, and they knew how to put a lot of food on a table. And so that was great for me and my family. So we learned to do that. Last week we started a series called A Recipe for Spiritual Growth. And so you're probably wondering why we spent so much time talking about barbecue. It will make sense a little later on, I promise. But we started this series, A Recipe for Spiritual Growth. And in this series, we are looking at a very simple recipe when it comes to spiritual growth. And we're looking at a few different ingredients that we can use to help us along the way. And so we launched from this verse where we get the story of where Jesus is encountering these religious leaders of his day. And the religious leaders came to him and they asked him, hey, what is the greatest commandment? What is the most important things when it comes to your spiritual life, when it comes to following God? And here's how he responded. Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And this is what everyone absolutely expected Jesus to say, but instead of stopping there, which is what everyone expected, he continued. He said, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. So Jesus says that the two most important things you can do in your faith is one, love God, and two, and equally as important, is to love others. And from these two commandments, really, as a church, we get our working definition of spiritual growth. We say that spiritual growth is a growing faith in God, validated by a growing love for God and others. So, in other words, if you increase your love for God and you increase your love for other people, in theory, your faith should increase as well, right? And so our extremely simplistic recipe for spiritual growth is this. If you take your faith and you add love for God and you add love for others, you are going to experience spiritual growth. And this is true for all levels of faith, from the person who's just exploring if God is even real, to the person who's just made a decision to follow Jesus, to the person who's been following for 50 years. Wherever you are in your faith, if you add to your love for God and you add to your love for others, the result should be spiritual growth. And the reason that this is important for our faith is that just like anything else in life, we have the tendency to fall into this self-serving trap where anything we do, we ask this question of what is it that I can get out of it? How is this going to benefit me? And so our tendency is to prioritize ourselves when it comes to anything. And so what we've learned is that we have to work at Jesus said, loving God and loving others, or loving our neighbors. And so the question we asked last week was, how is it that we increase our love for God and we increase our love for others? And so last week we tackled this God piece of how we increase our love for God. And that's really what most people think about when it comes to spiritual growth. That is their focus. How do I spend time with God? How do I grow that relationship? And it usually focuses on Bible reading and prayer. And so how is it that we learn about God, and how is it that we learn how to choose the right actions and how to make the right choices to reflect those truths that we've learned? And we talked a little bit about what that could look like and how it could look differently maybe than you were taught growing up or than you've experienced. There's a lot of different options with how we can increase our love for God. And so the ingredient we focused on last week was understanding. And we said this, that just knowing facts about God and just following certain rules does not necessarily lead to spiritual growth. But if we gain understanding about God, if we know why something is important to God, that is when it's going to create spiritual growth. And so if we understand why something matters to God, we will likely find that it matters more to us as well. And so the next 2 weeks, we're going to focus on the love for others part. This week, we're going to tackle really two different sides from it. We're going to tackle the fact that we have to love other believers. We have to love other people around us who believe the same thing. And then the following week, we're going to tackle the fact that we have to love others who maybe don't believe the same things that we believe, who maybe aren't followers of Jesus. And so we're going to look at both sides because both things are important when it comes to loving others. And I'm going to admit from the very beginning that this is a very complex topic. It's messy when you talk about loving people. Anytime people are involved, relationships are messy. And so there's no way that we can cover all of what it means to love others. And in fact, we're just going to look at one very specific lens, really one specific ingredient. And it's not comprehensive by any means, but if we can't solve every issue with this, but if we can get this right, it's going to make everything else much easier. And so Jesus thought this was a big deal as well. And so he made a point not just to talk about this issue that we're going to talk about. He made a point even to spend time praying about this issue. And we get to see a glimpse into that, into this very unique prayer that we find in John 17. And John was one of Jesus's closest disciples, and he was with him when Jesus prayed this prayer. And so he recorded it for us. And this passage is known as the high priestly prayer. And we're going to look at a couple little pieces out of that. And this happened really shortly before Jesus was arrested and killed on the cross. This is when he took the time to pray for his disciples, this high priestly prayer, because he knew he wouldn't be around much longer. And so he said he went to God in prayer, praying for what would happen to his disciples after he left. And so in part of his prayer, he says this. He says, my prayer is not for them alone. I pray also for those who will believe in me through their message. And so this prayer is especially unique in the fact that if you are a Jesus follower, Jesus prayed this prayer with you in mind. He prayed specifically for you. He jumped from praying for his disciples to praying for anyone who would believe in the future. That's you and that's me. And that's just mind-blowing to me to know that Jesus prayed specifically with me in mind and with you in mind. And here's what he prayed for us. He said that all of them may be one. Father, just as you are in me and I am in you, may they also be in us so that the world may believe that you have sent me. So Jesus prays that his future followers would be one. Just as he and the Father are one, his followers should be one. And for a very, very important reason, so that the world would believe that he was sent by God and that he was who he said he was. Us being one has a huge influence on how we love others and what others believe about God. And so the ingredient that we're going to talk about this week is unity. And as we consider spiritual growth, as we consider how to get along with others, we've got to consider unity. And we all probably, if we're honest, think that we're pretty decent at this, right? We give ourselves a pass or go, yeah, we're good with that. And sure, maybe there's a couple people that aren't our first choice to hang out with, but for the most part, we can get along with the people around us, right? And so when you think about our church, or maybe a single church, some of the churches that you've been in, really, and when I'm talking about a single church, I'm talking about a small C church. And so as you think about a church and the people in it, you're generally pretty unified. Now, not always. There are some unique situations, but for the most part, a single church, a single group of believers is unified. After all, you go to the same church, which means you likely have a similar taste in worship. You likely have similar taste in church practices. You likely have a similar general theology, right? That's why you chose that church. That's why you chose to be around that specific group of people. You liked what it had to offer. But when you go from talking about a small C church to what I call the big C church or the universal church, there are all different kinds of churches out there. There are all different varieties of believers and practices and theology. And, it can be a different story altogether when you look at all of the different churches and all of the different believers. And so what you find is that the universal church can be a lot like barbecue. And there it is. Now you know why we started there, right? Depending on where you go, there is a different style. There are different ingredients involved. There's a different presentation of what church looked like. And there are some people who are very opinionated about what should be and what should not be included and what counts as barbecue and what doesn't count as barbecue. But I'm really talking about the church. That's just a nicer way to say it, right? So some people do not consider other styles of church as the real church. And so sadly, the truth is that we are all prone to some degree to this kind of thinking. And I know that I've probably done this at times. I probably still do this at times to some degree. And likely, if you're honest with yourself, you've probably felt this way at some point too, because again, it just makes sense. The reason we wind up where we are, the reason we choose a church for our family is based off our experiences and our beliefs and our preferences, right? And those are shaped, again, by our experience. They're shaped by our needs. They're shaped by our wants. They're shaped by our theological understandings. And so we choose a church based on what makes sense to us and what we agree with and what closely aligns with the things that we value. So of course you would feel like one style of church is more appealing, or maybe even, if we're honest, better than another style of church, right? And the problem is not that we have a preference. The problem is not that we understand the Bible in a certain way and how church should operate in a certain way. That even if you want to go so deep as to say, the problem is not that we have convictions about what church should and should not be. The problem comes when we discount other people's beliefs and understandings and convictions when they differ from ours, right? Because unity does not mean identical. Here's what I've learned. It takes all kinds of churches to reach all kinds of people. It takes all kinds of churches to reach all kinds of people, right? Our church will reach some people that another church won't, and other churches will reach people that our church can't. And that is a good thing, right? But all too often, the small C churches view other small C churches as competition, and not that we're on the same team, that the big C church is actually one big team, and it doesn't have to be that way. And even though the different churches may have different playing styles, or we may have different views, it doesn't mean that we're opposed to each other. It doesn't mean that we have to be against each other. You don't have to root against a church that doesn't follow your style or that doesn't fit your style. And too often we forget this truth, that it is possible to support the progress of something that isn't your preference. It's possible to support the progress of something that isn't your preference. And here's the deal. This whole debate, this whole issue is not new to churches in our time. It's not new to modern churches. In fact, these debates, these arguments have gone on as long as the church has existed. And we find stories of people arguing about what should be or shouldn't be included, what should be practiced or shouldn't be practiced, what beliefs are right, what beliefs are wrong. We find that all throughout the New Testament. And Paul, even in some of his letters, he would address those things. And in one very specific letter to the early church in Rome, he addresses it. And listen to what he says. He says this: "Accept the one whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters." Accept the one whose faith is weak without quarreling over disputable matters. And something that really feels like it was ignored in churches when I grew up, and in many ways almost was taught against, is that there can be a weaker faith, or there can be maybe a faith that doesn't have the same understanding. The way that I was taught, really, and the way it was demonstrated for me, was there's really only one right option when it comes to faith. There's only really one right answer, and you either have correct faith or you have no faith at all. And some of you may have experienced something like that. But Paul says this, that there is a weaker faith that is acceptable faith, right? And it's a strange concept, I know, especially in a series about spiritual growth, to go, hey, there's a weaker faith, but it's still acceptable faith. But just because somebody has a weaker faith or a different faith or a different understanding of their faith doesn't mean that it's not a valid faith, right? It just makes faith messier. Paul says this, he says, "Do not quarrel over disputable matters." And depending on the background and the experience you had, this idea of disputable matters could be foreign to you. I've been parts of churches where there's only one right option and there is no room for debate. And in fact, if you maybe at some point have walked away from church, this may be one of the reasons why. Because any question you may have raised or that someone else may have raised that had an opposing view to what that church believed or what that church taught was likely dealt with swiftly and harshly. And that could be the reason why people have left the church, or if that's your experience, why you have left the church, because they said there was one right answer. And basically, I've felt the same thing. Anything other than that one right answer to them is heresy. But quite frankly, like I said, I've been guilty of this myself. Paul says, though, here in the Bible, that there are absolutely some things that are disputable. So there are some faith matters that have multiple valid, acceptable options. You can have different opinions on certain things on faith, and it's still valid faith. And sometimes, as we're going to see in a second, there are people that can believe two different things and both be right. So Paul gives us a couple examples that are familiar to the audience of his time. He says this: one person's faith allows them to eat anything, but another whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. And so there were a lot of different traditions and rules around dietary restrictions back in Paul's day. And there were certain meats to Jews. There were certain meats that were off limits. And then if you weren't a Jew, it was not uncommon to be offered meat that had been sacrificed for an idol. And so it created this debate about whether it was okay to eat something that's sacrificed for an idol if you're a Jesus follower or not. It created this whole spiritual debate whether that was acceptable or not. And so Paul goes on with this conversation. He says, the one who eats everything must not treat with contempt the one who does not. And the one who does not eat everything must not judge the one who does, for God has accepted them. So Paul says, regardless of which side you land on, regardless of whether you fall on this side of the issue or the other side of the issue, you should not look down on the other person. You should not judge the other person and their opposing view. After all, if God has accepted them, what grounds do you have not to? And Paul asks almost that exact same question, but in a slightly different way. He says, who are you to judge someone else's servant? To their own master, servants stand or fall, and they will stand, for the Lord is able to make them stand. Paul said, this is God's job to judge. This is not your job to judge their decision, right? They are accountable to the Lord first. And God, in His infinite wisdom, can somehow justify both views, even if they somehow seem opposing. One doesn't have to be right, and the other has to be wrong. God somehow can make both views right. And so Paul goes on and says, just in case you're not getting this, or just in case this is hard to understand, let me give you another example. One person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind. And so many Jesus followers, again, came from a Jewish background where they had this list of certain holy days that had to be kept. And so some of them carried that over into believing Jesus and into following Jesus, and they kept that tradition in their faith. Others didn't. And then there were some people who really weren't connected to Judaism before at all, and they had no background. They had no concept of these different holy days. And so again, these arguments would arise about what days are holy, what days are not holy, and which ones you had to keep and which ones you didn't have to keep. And Paul says, what matters is not what you choose, but the convictions behind why you choose that. So this sort of goes back to last week when we talked about gaining understanding with God and increasing our love for God, right? The more you understand, and in that personal relationship, how it is that you understand this works before God can be different than someone else. And you have to form that for yourself in that time and in that understanding with God. So Paul goes on to summarize. He says, whoever regards one day as special does so to the Lord. Whoever eats meat does so to the Lord, for they give thanks to God, and whoever abstains does so to the Lord and give thanks to God. Paul says this: as long as you're honoring God, as long as it's about giving thanks to God, as long as it's about honoring God in your decisions and in your actions, both can absolutely be viable. In fact, he goes on later in this letter to say that it's when you start to doubt your convictions, it's when you have questions about it, and it's when you act against your convictions, that's when you dishonor God. When you go against your beliefs, that is when God is most dishonored. But at least some things in faith are disputable. There's more than one valid option, as Paul has demonstrated for us, which means that being one, which means that being united and unified in Christ does not mean that we have to agree on everything. Again, unity doesn't mean identical. We don't have to have a consensus on everything in order to be unified. And as contrary as it sounds, we can have division without having disunity, because I believe this, that division, even in churches and amongst different churches, can be healthy. And this is why, because division can bring order and clarity. Division can bring order and clarity. Different types of churches really wind up divided because of different disputable matters, right? Again, the reason people attend a certain church lines up with their beliefs and their desires and their expectations of that church, normally around some type of disputable matter, right? And if you go to some of these churches and you change something as simple as music style or the type of chair that they sit in, that will unleash chaos in some of these churches, right? And so having distinct beliefs and practices and staying consistent brings order. That's why churches have different beliefs, and that's why they stay to them. But knowing how and what to expect of another church, or how do you know? The question is, how do you know what to expect of another church? And knowing what a church believes and practices and how those differ from other churches, that's what brings clarity. So a church staying consistent brings order. A church knowing how it's different from another church brings clarity, right? It helps you know what their beliefs and practices are, and it helps you know whether you line up with this church or whether you line up with a different church in your views, in your beliefs, in your practices. And that's why, honestly, if you've ever been at a church that you loved and you moved, or for whatever reason you have to find another church or a different church, it can be difficult to find a church that lines up with what you have experienced and what your beliefs and what your convictions and what your expectations are, right? Because it takes time to gain clarity on some of those details. And so churches need division to some degree. They need division because it brings order and it brings clarity for the people who attend. But you can be divided and still be unified. You can be divided and still be unified. You can have different beliefs, you can have different practices, but still work together in different churches and different believers towards a common goal, right? One of my favorite quotes about this topic comes from St. Augustine, not the city in Florida, but he was an early church father. He lived a couple hundred years or a few hundred years after Paul wrote his letter to the Romans, and he sort of tackles this same issue, but in a much broader stroke. So St. Augustine, or Augustine, as some people would say, he gives us this quote. It says, "In the essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity." So in the essentials, unity. In the essentials, there has to be unity. There are some things in our faith that absolutely we all have to agree on. There are things that are worth drawing the line for the integrity of our faith. And that is absolutely true. And as Jesus followers, we have to have this list of non-negotiables that we must hold in common. But I think the reality is that we've made that list sometimes a lot longer than it should be. I know that in my life, at times, it has been an extremely long list. And who knows, I'll just throw this out there. Maybe at this point, my list could be a little too short right now. But the way we tend to think, or the way I tend to think, and the way I tend to gauge what is essential and what is not, is that if I would not expect this from a 5-year-old making the decision to follow Jesus, it's probably not essential. If it's not in that very short list of things that I'm looking for a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old to be able to explain to me as they're making a decision, it's probably not essential, which makes this list, for me anyways, shockingly small. Do you believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that He came and died on the cross for our sins because we owed a debt that we couldn't pay? And do you believe that He rose again and conquered sin and death? And that is pretty much my list of essentials, right? And you may want to add a thing or two, or you may want to expand on some of that, but that for me is my minimum list of what is absolutely 100% essential. Now, that does not mean by any means that there are not other things that are absolutely incredibly important. It just means that as I see it, that those things are not 100% essential and necessary to following Jesus, which by default puts them in the non-essentials category. And St. Augustine says in non-essentials, what we should have is liberty. So when it comes to non-essentials, we should have liberty. There should be room for different opinions, and as Paul calls it, there should be room for different opinions on disputable matters. So everything that is a non-essential, we can lump into this category of disputable matters, right? And I understand this, that some matters are more disputable than others, and you likely have some strong opinions and convictions on certain things, and I do as well. So your options are you can either slide those things up into the essentials category, or as I do, you probably have some tiers within this non-essentials of what's really important to you and what's less important to you, and you can sort of slide those things within those different tiers. And so we just have to really just figure out, and this is probably not even a real word, but what level of disputability we think these issues fall on, right? But because this is something that each individual has to figure out for themselves. Again, if it's disputable, then one person can't set the standard for it. Everybody has to figure it out on their own. They have to figure out where they hold strong, deep convictions and where they see that there's still room for differences in understanding and interpretations. But the last thing St. Augustine says is this, that in all things, that everything we do, whether we hold to it strongly or whether we're willing to flex on it, in all things, we need to have charity. We should demonstrate loving kindness towards others, regardless of what their beliefs on. And where we fall short often, as me as a person and us as a church at large, I think, is this charity piece. Rather than offering loving kindness to people who view things differently or have different opinions, really, honestly, we do the exact opposite. We offer harsh judgment. We offer disapproval. And I think one of the healthiest things, as we talk about spiritual growth, one of the healthiest things you can do to grow spiritually is to be challenged in your beliefs and ask yourself, why is it that you believe what it is that you believe? It's taking the time to genuinely consider an alternative, to consider someone else's perspective and hear their opinion in that matter. And when you do, it's going to lead you to do one of two things. One, it's going to lead you to double down on what you believe and feel even more strongly about why you believe that. It's going to cause you to affirm your beliefs. But on the other hand, you might just find that when you're confronted with someone else's different opinion, and if you take the time to genuinely examine that, you could find that God is actually using that moment and that situation to teach you something new and teach you something different. Either way, you have the opportunity to grow spiritually, whether standing more firm in your beliefs or maybe learning something new and considering a different belief. But if we go back to our recipe, if you take your faith and you add in love for God, you add in love for others, you should grow spiritually. And so learning to live in unity with other people, with other believers specifically, makes it easier to love them. It's much easier, again, just at a glance, it's much easier to love someone that you agree with. It's much easier to love people that share the same view as you. That honestly does not take much faith. But learning to live in unity with people who hold opposing views, that doesn't just challenge your faith. That grows your faith, because unity is not dependent upon consensus. It doesn't mean that you have to be identical in your views and your beliefs and in your faiths. And while we tend to rally around the things that we agree on and build walls against the things that we disagree on, what unifies us really honestly is not our practices. What unifies us is a person. We are united around the person of Jesus Christ. And if we can get this right, if we can make Him the focus, if we can make Him the center of what unifies us, it's not only going to help us grow spiritually, but it's going to become a powerful witness to those who are around us. And that is exactly what we are going to talk about next week as we conclude our series, A Recipe for Spiritual Growth. So do not miss next week. Let me pray for us. God, we thank you, God, that you love us. God, that you loved us before we even had the opportunity to love you or anyone else. You made that decision for us, God. And we thank you that you give us the opportunity to love you, God, and to learn how to love you and to learn how to love others, God. And if I'm 100% honest, it is not always easy. God, is especially difficult when I encounter people who don't line up with the same things that I believe, who don't practice the same things I practice. God, I can find that challenging, God. And so as we go through life and we encounter those situations, as we encounter those people, God, just help us to be mindful of the fact that there are things that we don't have to agree on. God, and we can still experience unity. We can still be united. We can still love those people, God. And as a church, just help us to get this right. Help us never to be prideful, God. Help us never to look at other churches and think, that's no good. God, but we would cheer on what other churches are doing just as we would hope that they would cheer on what we're doing. God, just be with us this week as we look for opportunities to love others despite our differences. In your name we pray. Amen.